Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar from the Global Adaptation Working Group of the Global Alliance for Building and Construction. We are very happy to welcome you all. We have received a very substantial amount of registration for this event, so we are quite happy about that. I would like to thank all of our members for their work during the whole process leading up to this event. I want to thank every panelist that is going to present some part of this presentation today. As I've just said, we have received more than 500 registrations, which is a lot, but the webinar room in Zoom only allows for 500 people. So if you share, if many or multiple people of the same organization can share a screen, this would actually help a lot in allowing more people to take part in this event. So the aim of this event, of this side event, is to share knowledge on adaptation and resilience ahead of COP27, and especially to make sure that actors and stakeholders of the buildings and construction sector share knowledge and know-how on adaptation and resilience so that we can all go to the COP27 with the same basic knowledge and raise our ambitions further. So the course of event is as follows. We are going to present the Global Alliance for Building and Construction, its ambitions for the buildings and construction sector, and what the Adaptation Working Group does with regards to adaptation to climate change. Then we are going to talk about the previous work that we did for previous COPs, specifically our report call for action for the buildings and construction sector. And then we are going to talk in much details about the 10 principles for effective action, which is also a call to action that we are implementing. We have been implementing the whole year and will implement further in COP27 and in numerous events. So following these 10 principles, the presentation of these 10 principles, we are going to go into this year's work, which is first initiative notices about resilience and adaptation in the building sector. And we will have guest speakers who are going to present innovative and actionable projects in terms of adaptation to wildfire. And then we're going to go into the second work that we produced this year, which is a catalog of methodologies and tools for resilience assessment. And then we are going to conclude and talk about the next events that will promote adaptation and resilience. So I will now give the floor to Judy Zakreski, who is the Vice President of Global Services for the International Code Council and is a co-chair of this working group. And she's going to introduce our work and how we will go forward. Judy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Victor. And I'm actually not seeing I'm seeing your slide not in presentation mode. I'm seeing your slide deck, and I'm only seeing the title slide. So I'm not sure if they've been advancing.
We have a slight technical glitch on our side. We'll be able to fix that in one moment. Just 1 second.
Okay, well, in order to not waste time, I think we should be on slide 5 at this point. But I'll just start. I'm Judy Zakreski, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Global ABC Climate Change Adaptation Working Group. For those of you who are not familiar with Global ABC, I'd like to provide a brief introduction. Global ABC is an organization within the United Nations Environment Program. It was launched in 2015 during the 21st Conference of the Parties, or COP21, which was held in Paris. Global ABC is a voluntary partnership of national and local governments, intergovernmental organizations, businesses, associations, networks, and think tanks that are committed to a common vision, which is a zero-emission, efficient, and resilient buildings and construction sector. The Global ABC is a sort of network of networks. It brings together initiatives and actors that are focused on the buildings and construction sector. And the Global ABC network currently includes over 130 members, including 29 countries. Next slide, please. Global ABC. Thank you. Yes, Global ABC's work is very important in the context of climate change, not only because the construction and operation of buildings is estimated to contribute approximately 40% of total global greenhouse gas emissions, but also because so much construction is currently underway globally. The equivalent of Paris is added in floor space every 5 days. And it's estimated that the equivalent floor space of what currently exists in all of Japan is expected to be added every year between now and 2060. Another way to look at this is that half of the buildings that will be standing in 2060 have not yet been built. And this number of new buildings is likely to grow rapidly in the coming years, especially in Africa and Asia. And the rapid growth is going to challenge the target of a 30% energy intensity improvement in buildings by 2030, which is needed to put the sector on track to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And so what we build today will be our emissions legacy. And so the buildings and construction sector really needs to lock in new forms of energy efficiency, green materials, and better practice in design and construction. And this is why Global ABC is working to produce important, relevant, and challenging tools and resources that help to focus the buildings and construction sector on its readiness to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. The Global ABC flagship product, the annual Global Status Report for Buildings and Construction, tracks global progress on key indicators for energy use, emissions, technologies, policies, and investments. The Global ABC global and regional roadmaps for buildings and construction in Africa, Asia, and Latin America help to set pathways to decarbonization of the buildings and construction sector by 2050. And the Global ABC working groups, including the Climate Change Adaptation Working Group, which is hosting this side event, are set up to drill down and focus on key areas within the sector and to produce additional collateral material and initiatives like the ones that you'll hear about during this event. Next slide, please. The focus of the Climate Change Adaptation Working Group is on ensuring that both existing and new buildings are constructed to ensure that they'll be resilient to the hazards that should be anticipated during the building's service life. We've already seen increasingly frequent and severe weather hazards like heat waves, flooding, intense precipitation, and increased wildfires that can be attributed to climate change. And unfortunately, this trend is expected to continue and will likely worsen. So in addition to the important role that the building and construction sectors can play in mitigating the impacts of climate change, it's equally urgent to ensure that buildings are constructed or improved to protect people from anticipated future hazards. And as you can imagine, and if you're joining this webinar, hopefully you know and understand that this requires a significant mindset shift and a recommitment among and by stakeholders in the sector, including owners, insurers, designers, and builders, as well as regulators, who all need to integrate climate science into building planning, construction, and renovation. At last year's COP26, the work of the Adaptation Working Group kicked off a call to action to address the adaptation of buildings and the impacts of climate change, and to promote and to commit to the adherence to the 10 principles for effective action in adapting the building sector to climate change, which were issued just before COP26. And so now it's my pleasure and honor to turn the discussion over to my fellow co-chair, Karim Salouane, to provide you with more information and background about this important initiative, which has been the foundation of the work that the Adaptation Working Group has done over the past year, and which will continue, as Victor said, to drive our efforts at COP27 and into 2023. Karim?
Yes.
Yes.
Judy, actually, before Karim, we will talk about the previous actions that we led, as Judy just explained. You mentioned, sorry, Judy, you mentioned the call for action first. And so we're going to go in more details about the call for action that we developed with Sakina Penpoint, who is the adaptation secretariat she's the secretary for the Adaptation Working Group and head of the adaptation at the Green Building Observatory. And she's going to introduce our work. So Sakina, the floor is yours, and then Karim will present the 10 principles.
Thank you, Victor.
So I'm going to talk about this report that's named Building and Climate Change Adaptation, a Call to Action. And this report is the first output of the Global ABC Adaptation Working Group. The need for more information for climate change adaptation in the building sector was first expressed at COP24 in Katowice in 2018, after a meeting gathering the global ABC members and representative of the Kingdom of Morocco. So this report was then coordinated by the Green Building Agency with the support of the French Ministry of Ecological Transition. Indeed, climate change is, of course, and you know all about it, considered as the main issue that humanity will face in this century, and the built environment is particularly at risk. And although far from beyond that, the government and all the actors along the building and the construction value chain therefore need to take action, as climate risk is a real threat. And building as the long-term asset should be resilient to climate change and other future risks. So this report is divided in 3 parts. The first part is named "Why does adapting building to climate change matters?" In this part, the report provides definitions and defines terms that are frequently used to talk about climate change as risk, exposure, vulnerability, maladaptation, etc. As you can see on this slide, to assess climate hazard risk, the studies are based on a combination of exposure and vulnerability, exposure depending on the address, vulnerability depending on sensitivity and use. And I won't spend too much time detailing the process, but let you go into detail reading this risk report and other methodologies that are assessing risk and resilience as well. Then the second part, the second part is focusing is named Adapting the Real Estate, Building and Construction Sector to Climate Change. The first question that was the first question was, what are the impacts of climate change on the building sectors? There are 2 kinds of impacts: the transition risk and the physical risk. 2 kinds of risk, sorry. In the transition risk, we count market risk related to regulation and policy, technological risk, and reputational risk. Among the physical risk, there are direct and physical consequences. There are direct and physical consequences of climate that we already know: heat waves, droughts, sea level rise, intensification of extreme events as floods and storms, etc., and fires as well, that we're going to talk after that. Concerning the part that we went into detail in the second part of the building, the section on mitigation and adaptation solutions, we went over solutions that fight different physical risks, but that are identified as replying to both mitigation and adaptation as well. And to go further, we should always favor adaptive action that has better co-benefits and fully refuse adaptation that would participate in increasing vulnerabilities on other systems like people or time, further vulnerabilities in the future. Also, adapting the building sector consists in adapting the whole building life cycle, which include all the steps that are displayed in the third picture. Slide. And the third and last part of this report is the one that is the most detailed to provide a real indication for each stakeholders that are in this place in function of their professional occupation, because the challenge for each profession are very different. So there is the list of stakeholders. 9 sections are dedicated to governments, local authorities, investors and asset managers, property developers, insurers and reinsurers, architects, engineering companies, material, equipment and construction, and property and facility managers. And in each section, that are 4 to 5 pages long, you can find 5 main challenges that are identified. The part that is focused on context and bibliography, the state of play, the 5 main recommendation tools that are recommended for this profession, and case studies and best practices. So you can find the link to visit this report and download this report on the Global ABC website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sakina. And so now we are going to present the second work that we did last year for last COP, which is the 10 principles for effective actions when adapting the building sector to climate change. And I will invite to the floor Karim Selwan, who is the main redactor for this report. He's also an adaptation working group co-chair, and he's the head of resilience and climate change adaptation and also founder of Resilience. So Karim, the floor is yours.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Sakina. Thank you, Victor. I will now to introduce you the 10 principles for effective action. But first of all, you need to know that the 10 principle was launched in the last COP26. The Global ABC proposing the 10 principles for effective action to policymakers and the practitioners to join forces and spread climate change adaptation action in the building sector and willing to track annual progress. It's very important to know that we need and we are looking for some KPI, some indicator to track and to follow up the progress of the action of adaptation with a tangible example or use cases. Well, and why? Why? Because you know that we are facing a big issues facing the global warming, the global change, and the impact of the built environment. The next slide, please. In fact, today and the current situation for the climate context proves that we are needed for more action dedicated to climate change, resilience, and adaptation. Why? Because the cost of the inaction became more and more important than the investment of adaptation. For example, we know that the modern cities and built environment are more shocks and stresses due to climate change. In the parallel, the adaptation will cost around more than a lot of billion euros per year. We are bound by the urban area, for example, and what we are observing, we observe that the balance of power between all the stakeholders dedicated to the built environment sector, building, real estate, urban planning, and the construction industry are absolutely changing. Why? Because the question is, we want to share, we want to support the risk, and how we could anticipate the most information to promote a new way to design adaptation process, a new adaptation program dedicated to built environments. Next slide. That's why we launched during the last COP26 the 10 principle, the 10 principle for effective action for adaptation of the building sector to climate change. This is a simple, very simple action. Then a manifesto. First of all, this is the urgency, act now. The second point, stakeholders consider the systemic integration of the measure of adaptation across the entire value chain from the design, build, and maintenance and operation phases. The process consider adaptation along the entire life cycle of an asset, for example, through the design, build, maintenance, and operation of building. Mitigation, very important to be aligned with the SDGs, to be aligned with the climate change mitigation of the gas emission. We need to build in the tandem mitigation action with adaptation action. This is not the opposite action. It should be very aligned, both. It's very important. The fifth, it's data. Why data? Because you know that to progress concerning the knowledge of climate data predictive model, for the lot of data, very important to have the most of the best information to design the best adaptation solution. That's why it's very important to understand that the climate risk data and accept the uncertainty, of course, because we know that the climate change proposes the several scenarios of climate predictive modeling, and we know that we need to accept a certain level of uncertainty. And the question is, who want to share this uncertainty? After, the sixth point is the scale. Things beyond asset level, we need to analyze a building, the building scale, the quarter scale, the city scale, the territory scale, and we know that this is a systemic with a lot of type of scale of analysis. It should be sometime combined because, for example, if you analyze the building should be connected with a lot of critical infrastructure, and the critical infrastructure sometimes could be very with the more large scale than the building. The green solution considers a nature-based solution. It should be, we need to promote also the nature-based solution inside the design of adaptation solution. People, of course, promote a just adaptation of the building sector. What we mean about the promote a just adaptation, it should be something very profitable at the same time, but also inclusive for all the population, not only for the rich, for the poor, for the middle class, and for the rich population. It's very important to be very fair action. The main point, this is the finance. Enable adaptation of the building sector. We know that the key issue, the key factor for the success of the adaptation will be the finance. How we could finance the adaptation. The question is if we need to consider the finance as a cost or as an investment. It could be a discussion, but it's very important to integrate the finance. Without money, without finance, without investment, no adaptation. And the last point is the local, the fit adaptation measure to the local context. Very important, because we know that the global change is a global context, and this is from the global to the local action. Very important. Why the local? Because we need to be very aligned with the specific geographical criteria, with the local stakeholders, with the local geopolitical context, social context, cultural context. Without these components, the effective of the adaptation could be not absolutely relevant. Very important. Next point. Now, rapidly, I want to show you some example to illustrate each principle. For example, the mitigation as a prerequisite for efficient adaptation, it should be very aligned with the principle 1 and 4. Structuring an holistic vision in the uncertainty climate change predictive scenario to support the actors or facilitate the operational implementation in the construction sector, absolutely aligned, for example, with the principle number 2, 5, 6, and 9. Generic framework, which can be used for the new building, but especially for renovation for existing building, for example, propose a multi-criterion global approach, or at the scale of the building and development, including infrastructure, absolutely aligned with the principle number 2, 3, 6, and 9. Second, the next slide, please. We continue. Planning services and territorial cooperation, very important. This is the planning and regulation, continuity of services and degraded modes, territorial cooperation, absolutely aligned also with the principle number 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, and 10. Studies and ecological diagnosis on the site. Field diagnosis, studies and knowledge of the impact of climate change specific to the territories, water and nature-based solution, absolutely aligned with the principle number 2, 5, 6, 9, and 10. Next. Health and comfort for all, of course, absolutely important, notably in the context of the heat wave for the facing the urban heat island, limitation of the nuisance and the pollution, cooling solution, accessibility, aligned with the principle 5, 6, 7, 8, and 10. And uses and behavior, very important, because a lot of the part of the success of the adaptation depend on the uses and the behavior. because we know that the technical component have a limit of technical solution, technical capacity, and also the cost. And the big part of the success of adaptation could depend on the uses and behavior. For example, through the mutualization of the shared spaces, evacuation of shelter areas, knowledge and information, aligned with the principle number 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. Next. And now for the last one, we speak about, because if you remember, we speak about the scale. What is the scale analysis? Depend on the build scale, city scale, etc. Urban forms, structures, and components, design option and construction method for building integrity, adaptability and the versatility of the building, nature-based solution, and bioclimatism design architecture, aligned with the principle number 2, 3, 7, 9, and 10. Next. Well, now, because you could find most of information, because you could download the PDF on the website of the Global ABC, you write in the Google the 10 principles for effective action, and you could write for more information. But what is very important, the 10 principles for effective action should be used during all life cycle of building, construction, and climate change adaptation, from the planning phases, construction phases, and maintenance phases. Very, very important. Each phase should have a specific adaptation process. This is not the same process, for example, during the planning phases and the maintenance phases. Very important. Last one. And to conclude, very important, to conclude my pitch, the message for us is the implementation of these 10 principles is the key to the common and the transversal adaptation strategy for the building sector. And we are absolutely looking for to join this action, to join this call for action. If you are interested to support, we are ready to accompany you. Thank you very much. And thank you all my co-chair and my colleague of the Global ABC.
Thank you, Karim. And so as you said, the 10 Principles for Effective Action is actually a call for action, a manifesto. And Judy is going to now present the way it can be implemented alongside in tandem with other actions to show the universality of the 10 principles. So Judy, you can take back the floor.
Thank you very much, Karim, for that great introduction to the 10 principles, and Victor for the introduction to the Global Building Resilience Guidelines. The Global Building Resilience Guidelines were just released this week, posted on the Global Resiliency Dialogue, www.globalresiliency.org. It's listed on the slide. Just a bit of background, the Global Resiliency Dialogue is a group of building code development and research organizations from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States that had a shared recognition of the challenge that is caused by the widespread use of historical climate and risk data in building codes around the world, and the need to examine how to effectively integrate future-focused climate science into building codes, especially to define risk and hazard maps for adaptation purposes. And so similarly to the motivation behind the Global ABC Adaptation Working Group in its production of the call to action and the 10 principles, the Global ABC members were motivated by the recognition that the buildings constructed today based on modern building codes need to withstand hazards that they'll face in their expected service life in 50 to 100 years. So the guidelines are the work of the Global Resiliency Dialogue that began in early 2020 with the undertaking of 2 global surveys. And the findings from these surveys form the basis then of the guidelines. They're high-level principles for consideration in any country. They're not designed as a policy tool because they're designed to enable flexibility of use. And what they do is provide a series of considerations for regulators to draw upon to provide a higher level of resilience of buildings to future climate risk. And that will hopefully lead to changes in thinking about building safety in 2 outcome areas. One is to view the minimum requirements for providing occupant health and safety set forth in building codes and standards in the context of ongoing performance and functional recovery following more extreme weather events, so the resilience of the buildings. And secondly, to implement a novel reliance on climate science as well as downscaled modeling to avoid this one-size-fits-all approach. And so, as you've heard from Karim, I think there's some echoes of what we're looking to achieve. There's a huge alignment with the 10 principles. The 10 principles are a call to action to policymakers and practitioners to join forces and spread climate change adaptation actions in the building sector, to be willing to track annual progress. And the Global Building Resilience Guidelines help to identify solutions that will address the global change. That will address the challenge posed by increasingly frequent and extreme weather events. So in this first box on the upper left of this slide, I've listed some of the 10 principles on the left side of the bullet point, and then some of the considerations that are similarly addressed as potential pathways to solutions in the Global Building Resilience Guidelines. And then there are also additional considerations related to additional items that are not specifically covered, but certainly related to the 10 principles. And so I think it's fair to say that the governments and organizations that have signed on to support and implement the 10 principles could use the guidelines as a tool to get started or to press ahead in their efforts. And so I invite everyone to download the guidelines, get in touch with us if you have questions. And on that same website, you can also find all of the background information and the surveys that were published over the last 3 years. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. So this was the explanation of the previous work that our group did and the impact it already has and how it is aligned with the development of other works. And now we are going to go into explaining current works and future works, especially the first one being our effort to collect resilience and adaptation initiatives to create notices that will be actionable and a catalog of exemplary actions. So our motivation behind this work was the really fact that we created and designed the 10 principles as a manifesto, a call for action. And so in order to promote knowledge and experience sharing to accelerate resilience efforts and adaptation efforts around the world, it would be useful to actually see concrete examples, concrete projects that rely on the 10 principles or highlight specific points detailed in the 10 principles to show that successful projects, innovative projects, exemplary projects are aligned with the 10 principles, and the 10 principles are a real guideline to follow to adapt our building sector to climate change. And so the goal that we aimed for was to showcase the relevance of the 10 principles in a wide variety of projects across a wide variety of stakeholders and geographical scopes and asset scopes. So the 10 principles is not only specifically designed for buildings or for cities. It is a wide-ranging approach, all-encompassing approach when it comes to interpreting and implementing adaptation and resilience. So these initiative notices that we've been collected and designing aim at giving concrete examples of steps or full actions developed and taken by many different actors in line with the 10 principles. And we also really wanted to highlight innovative and exemplary adaptation actions, always in the goal of sharing knowledge and leveling up every actor around the world that may use or need examples or initiatives that they can rely on and use to develop their own knowledge and know-how. So the 10 principles were integrated into the experience into explaining the experience and the innovations that were led. So we produced a set of notices that are in the form that is shown on the screen, where we explain the details in various levels of details, how each project is implemented and how successful it was, the motivation behind each project. And then we also detail how they follow the 10 principles guideline or how their success highlights the universality of the 10 principles. So we were able to acquire. This is just a set of examples of projects that we are going to showcase in this project, in this initiative. And as you can see, we really want to show that the 10 principles are applicable to a full range of actions, be it infrastructure work or design or public incentive actions, or maybe even regulatory actions. And to show that it is a universal principle that can be applied both at the local and national level, that can target any kind of hazards and can concern any kind of stakeholders that just want to implement resilience action into their own projects. So our feedback notices are intended to be a tool to inspire stakeholders and actors in the building sector and the construction sector to go forward and implement resilience action in line with the 10 principles. So our feedback notices are always a work in progress, but the catalog that we already have is available on our website, globalabc-adaptation-wg.org, and you can have access to all the notices that we produced on this website. And it is meant to be an active source of inspiration, but it is also a work in progress. So we are always looking forward to new initiatives and innovative projects to be showcased in our work, in our website, and to inspire, to share knowledge with the same goal of sharing knowledge. So on the same website, you can also submit your own projects or projects you know about and you think might be interesting to share with the world, share with the community, and to move forward and always go further. And to give really an example of how the 10 principles are, the notices are designed, we thought it would be interesting to have one of the initiatives that we targeted and that we showcased be actually detailed in this presentation, in this conference. And that's why I will now invite to the floor our guest speakers for today, who are going to introduce a project that was led in Canada. And that the project, we made a notice about this project, and as it was very inspiring, we wanted them to explain what they did. So our guest speakers will be Marianne Armstrong, who is an initiative leader at the National Research Council in Canada, and she works in climate resilience of the built environment, and also Dan Sendig, who is the Director of Research at the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. So Marianne and Dan, thank you very much for agreeing to be part of this conference, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for inviting us today. It's a real pleasure to be here and to share an example of what we'll say is adaptation in action. We've been working at the Research Council since 2016 to integrate climate resilience into Canada's standards, guidelines, and codes for buildings and infrastructure. And certainly this is one of our greatest pieces of accomplishment, I'll say, is producing this guideline for wildland and urban interface fires. And also, I'm really pleased today to have Dan Sendig with us from the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction to talk about how this is now helping the people in British Columbia, and specifically in the village of Lytton, to build back better. So next page, please. So I myself am from the, oops, go back one, please. No problem. I myself am from the National Research Council of Canada, which is Canada's leading federal research and development organization. We have expertise in all sorts of areas, but I myself come from the Construction Research Center. I'll pass it over to Dan to introduce the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Victor, for the invitation to present today. It's a real pleasure to be here. The Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction is a disaster risk reduction research institute that is part of Western University, situated within the engineering department there. We're also an IRDR, International Center of Excellence, focused on residential disaster risk reduction. And we're initially formed and largely funded by the Canadian property and casualty insurance industry.
Next slide, please. So in around 2016, we started to look at Canada's infrastructure and buildings and do a gap analysis to understand what really was needed. And certainly there's a lot of work to do, and we've been doing a lot of work in this area ever since. But one of the items and one of the gaps that came out was the need for national guidance to address wildland fire. So we began working and formed a committee of 22 different members from across the country, internationally. We formed 4 different working or task groups to develop the guide. It took us a number of years, and there's a picture of it here, and I'll dive into what's in that on the next slide. And now this guideline is now moving to standard development. But why is this important to Canada? I think one of the main reasons is Canada is warming at twice the global rate. So we're experiencing the impacts of climate change every year. It seems there's new events coming up. It's even worse in the north, where we're warming at even more than twice the global rate. In the area of wildfires specifically, we're seeing the events become more severe and more frequent. We're seeing the costs, we're seeing the losses. A few examples on here. Between 2015 and 2017, in a 3-year time span, we had 200,000 Canadians evacuated due to wildfire. There's a few very large events highlighted here. One notably, the 2016 Fort McMurray fire, probably the largest wildfire event in Canada. We've seen over 2,400 structures destroyed and insured losses in the billions. So highlighting really the urgency and the need to act. The particular event we're speaking about today in the village of Lytton, BC, is quite unfortunate, and unfortunately Lytton has this, owns the record for the hottest temperature ever seen in Canada. And so this particular village saw 3 days that broke the records in Canada. And the very next day, wildfires swept through the valley and destroyed the majority of the town, leaving the over 250 residents homeless. So it's been a very unfortunate event, and Dan has been working very closely with this village to help apply the guidance that thankfully we've been developing and enable them to build back better. Next page, please. So the wildfire guideline itself is the most comprehensive guideline in this area we have in Canada. It contains information on identifying the hazard as well as exposure, including fuel type, topography, weather, exposure methods such as ember transport, radiation, convection, as well as direct flame. The third section includes a lot of what can be done at the building level. So in terms of risk mitigation in the structure ignition zone, so treatments of walls, different components, openings, gaps, screens, types of windows, doors, decking attachments, so very practical guidance there. The fourth section goes beyond just what you do at the building to community, including demographics, land use and planning, access and egress routes, areas of refuge, power and water supply, as well as firefighting response. And it also includes the final section on emergency planning and outreach. What I will do is I will paste the links in the chat near the end of the presentation, just so that people can go and access these documents. In addition to completing the Wildland Urban Interface Design Guide, we also undertook a cost benefit analysis or benefit cost analysis with the Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction. And some of the numbers are shown here, but I find it even more astounding that we saw through this study that for new houses, we could save over 30 to 1 in terms of benefit cost, which will cost about $5 or less than $5 per square foot, or 2% of construction cost. A little bit higher on the retrofit, about twice that for retrofit. And maybe one of the other findings from the study, which is really important, is that if you work with the community to control the vegetation and to cooperate, the cost of adaptation to wildfire goes down by 2/3, and the benefit cost ratio increases 3 times. So we really need to work together at both the community level and the building level to be effective. So I'm going to pass it over to Dan, who's now going to speak to how this guideline is being applied in the village of Lytton.
Sure, thank you, Marianne. If you could, there you go, thank you. So a few notes. I just have 2 very brief slides about what is actually happening practically with respect to adoption of the National Wildfire Guide in the Village of Lytton, some background about why there was work toward adoption of these recommendations. So as Marian mentioned, Lytton is located in British Columbia, central BC, was affected by this devastating wildfire in 2021, occasioned with this very high heat event. A few notes about the fire itself. So first, there was a fire investigation that was conducted by Jack Cohen, formerly of the U.S. Forest Service, and Alan Westhaver, that we published on our website, and we can also provide a link to that. And that study identified factors that led to ignition of structures throughout the building and also fire spread throughout the town. And a few notes about what was discovered there and why this supported implementation of sort of site scale, building level, and community level wildfire protection. So first, it was a very rapid surface fire. In Lytton, the fire regime is based on surface fuels, largely grass. So during that event, it was very dry, very hot. The fire spread rapidly through grass, shrubs, pine litter. And also there was a relative high density of structures. It was an urban sort of area with close proximity of structures, both primary structures, commercial buildings, institutional buildings, residential buildings, but also people sort of informal sheds, ancillary structures, workshops, and that sort of thing. And those combined sort of formal and informal structures really increased the density of structures in the village of Lytton and led to this fire vulnerability. As a result of the rapid surface fire spread and also the high density of structures, two conclusions of the fire investigation were that an initial attack, the sort of traditional fire suppression method used by fire management agencies, was unrealistic. The fire was spreading too quickly along multiple paths throughout the community, and on the map on the right indicates how the fires actually spread through the community through several vegetated corridors. And also that structural firefighting would have been quickly overwhelmed as well. So the fire spread from the fuel, from the vegetation to structures, and then from structure to structure, and the fire spread was very rapid. So amongst the many recommendations of this fire inspection were that there is a need to address easily ignitable homes and buildings throughout Lytton, such that they could sustain or reduce risk of ignition during a fire like this, and also specifically to adopt the NRC WUI Fire Guide. There was a bylaw that was produced. We worked with the Village of Lytton over the past, since late last year, 2021. There was a recovery committee that was set up to assist in recovery, rebuilding in Lytton, and through that committee, there was a recommendation to adopt the NRC WUI Guide. The guide itself was adjusted to meet local conditions, the local building conditions in Lytton, and there was a very sort of intensive process of citizen participation, of involvement with the local council. And I should note that there's actually several initiatives related to recovery in Lytton that serve to address the fact that they lost their municipal building and also all of their official records. So they had to go through a process of from scratch developing new bylaws, construction and building bylaws. And as part of that work, the village sought to become sort of a progressive building community, including greenhouse gas mitigation, accessibility, and also disaster risk reduction. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So the next slide provides very brief detail about the types of measures that were presented in that building protection bylaw for wildland fire. At a high level, there's two components. There's a fuel management component that sort of goes beyond the building itself, and then there's a building component. So the fuel management component was really modeled on the structure ignition zone approach that's presented in the National Wildfire Guide. So there's concentric sort of rings of importance with respect to fuel management around buildings in wildfire-prone areas. The intent here is to protect buildings both from radiative heat that would come off of a fire front, or convective actual contact with the flames, and also protect the building against embers. We find that embers are one of the primary drivers of building ignitions during wildfire events. So embers are lofted by fires. They fall on buildings, they fall on material on and around buildings. That material ignites, and then the building ignites from those materials. So management of fuel around the building is very important, and critically in Lytton, one of the major factors with respect to ignitions was debris, ignitable debris on properties close to buildings. There's some examples in the bottom left there of a shed, an unprotected shed. Also, storage up against buildings, that sort of thing, really increased the vulnerability of structures in Lytton. So managing those types of fuels, aside from also vegetative fuels, is a really important part of the protection approach. And then, as mentioned, construction, and Marian mentioned the construction measures outlined in Chapter 3 of the WUI Guide. These are all tailored to the types of buildings that are present in Lytton. And also, as part of the submission, the proposal for adoption of the NRC Wildfire Guide in Lytton, ICLR produced a localized cost-benefit assessment that detailed the cost of adoption of each of the specific construction recommendations, siding materials, decking materials, roofing materials, et cetera, that would go sort of beyond the basic code requirements. And then also presented a localized benefit, a societal benefit to adoption of those materials with respect to reduced ignition risk over time. So we'll go to the next slide, and I'll pass it back to Marian.
Great. Thank you, Dan. So given the focus today on Global ABC's 10 principles for effective adaptation or effective action, we're keen to speak towards how the Lytton Project and the Wildfire Guide really spoke to these principles. So I'm going to share with Dan a bit of a conversation, or we'll flip back and forth a little bit on how we see these principles applying in the work that we've done. So the first one is urgency. I think I spoke to the challenge in Canada right now around wildfire. There's really an urgency to get started and be active. I think Lytton, BC is an example of where the action wasn't soon enough. We are building back better, we're recovering, and we do thankfully have guidance since we started this work a few years ago. But that urgency is real, and we're seeing it across the board for wildfire, flooding. I'm trying to think, snow, like there's a lot of different loads in Canada that we're seeing that impact changing now on the way our buildings perform. The second item on stakeholders. So certainly we had a number of different stakeholders involved in the development of the WUI Guide. So this helps when we want it to be adopted readily across the country, having a number of different people involved in the development of that guide. We had material manufacturers, home builders, government at all levels, climate and building scientists, firefighters, just to name a few of the stakeholders that were involved in that process. And there's going to be more involved as well as we move that forward to becoming a standard that can then be used for regulation. Dan, you want to speak to Lytton and stakeholders?
Sure, yeah, so some notes about engaging the stakeholders specifically in Lytton. So one of the challenges in implementing sort of progressive building practices after disaster events, we find, throughout Canada, I'm sure it's consistent in other parts of the world, is that there is a very strong motivation for residents and local political leaders to get back to normal as quickly as possible. And that typically means reconstructing according to previously existing construction practices and not delaying construction by bringing in new practices that could potentially result, looking for sourcing of new materials and so on. And in order to sort of convince many of the residents and local decision makers that it was worthwhile to engage in risk reduction, it wasn't just a matter of presenting the building protection practices and making a benefit cost argument. We really had to engage the residents and respond to their many, many questions about implementation of the Wildfire Guide. And that included conducting the fire investigation, because there were questions about how buildings actually ignited and whether the measures that were being recommended would protect buildings in the future. So the fire investigation, the ignition, understanding the ignitions of buildings was an important part of convincing stakeholders that these activities were worthwhile. And on top of that, we engaged local experts as well, local consultants that were very much involved in fire protection, and these are sort of trusted voices. So as the combined, information from multiple organizations, from multiple independent voices, that was necessary to engage this community in this discussion. Also, with respect to involving others in the value chain, Lytton was sort of a nucleus of a lot of discussion from the insurance industry, from provincial governments, and others, and it was important to get all of these groups on board. And one of the motivating factors, which I suppose we'll talk about in the finance section, but one of the motivating factors for regulation of construction in Lytton is that in Canada and other jurisdictions, the insurance industry will cover the cost of new building regulation in reconstruction, but not necessarily voluntary recommendations for protection. So if we're able to implement a regulation, the insurance industry will cover the cost of building to that those additional construction requirements.
Thanks, Dan. For the third one on process and considering adaptation along the entire life cycle of an asset, certainly wildfire mitigation goes beyond just the construction phase. We have the construction, we also have guidance on retrofit of existing construction, but the maintenance component is also key. As stated, if we have those vegetation control and ignition and control of ignitable materials within that ignition zone throughout the life of the building and the community, certainly that will help to improve outcomes of wildfire. It's not something we can just build and leave, which is also why the guideline goes beyond just the building itself to the community, to those measures that are needed.
Right, and to add to that, part of the protection plan, long-term protection plan for Lytton includes a local fire smart coordinator, so a staff person who would be responsible for implementing fuel management practices. So as Marianne mentioned, these require ongoing maintenance, ongoing engagement with residents. We can't just construct and manage fuel as part of the redevelopment and then move on. It has to be maintained.
For the fourth item on mitigation and implementing adaptation and mitigation in tandem, something that we don't always think about is, okay, it's wildfire. We're not necessarily trying to build the greenest of the green buildings. Obviously, we're following the building code that is slowly being ratcheted up in Canada to become more green and more efficient. But I do want to bring up the fact that building durable construction, building construction that's not going to burn down, is ultimately going to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted during wildfire events, but also when you have to replace these structures, the embodied carbon that goes into building them. So there is a strong case for building things that are resilient to extreme events, resilient to climate change, to ensure that we're lowering the overall life cycle carbon that's produced. And in fact, we've been undertaking some studies at NRC in that area to understand how building more resilient construction, including bridges and roads, can help to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. On the fifth item here on data, the WUI guide has a strong data component clearly within the hazard as well as the exposure assessment. For hazards, we're leveraging data on the fuel, the types of fuel that are found across the country. There's maps that are developed with Canadian Forestry Service to help inform that work, topography, as well as weather data, current weather, but also we have been working, it's not necessarily in the guideline, there's mention of climate change impacts on wildfire in the guideline, but we've been working more specifically to better understand how climate change is going to affect wildfire hazard in Canada in future climates by working with the climate scientists to understand how Canada's climate is going to change and how those different fuels are going to change within our country. For the sixth item, scale and thinking beyond asset level, I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
Okay, thanks, Marianne. And so, as discussed earlier, the proposed bylaw itself includes construction measures for buildings, but also the site scale fuel management practices. But also an important part of the work in Lytton was development of a community fire protection plan that articulates many of the recommendations contained in the NRC WUI Fire Guide, including firefighting capacity with respect to water, egress, community design, and also going beyond the site itself with respect to fuel management, community level fuel management, and I mentioned before the need for ongoing maintenance, so specifically staff people on the ground that are responsible for ensuring that fuel is managed over time across the community.
I'm also going to turn it over to Dan for the next 4, so I'll stop interrupting him.
Sure. And so with respect to green approaches, so one of the important motivators for community level wildfire protection in Canada and then in other parts of the world where wildland fire is a concern is that the traditional approach of managing wildfire risk for communities, which was sort of heavily reliant on fire suppression, does have ecological costs. Our natural areas in Canada, forests, vegetated areas have fire regimes where recurring fire is an important part of ecological process. And what we found in several cases in Canada, the Fort McMurray fire was an example, and other fires in Canada, that long-term suppression not only has negative ecological impacts, but can also increase the intensity, severity of fires themselves due to buildup of burnable fuel in wildland areas over time. And that makes the fires harder to fight. But when they burn, they also have much more devastating impact ecologically as well as on our human systems. So protecting communities is an important component of moving back toward a more natural fire regime. If we protect communities, there's less pressure to fight fires around communities. Fires can burn as they naturally would. While communities are protected, they won't necessarily burn. So that's an important part of the overall approach of community level wildfire protection, certainly in Canada. With respect to the people component or promoting a just adaptation in the building sector, there was some interest in, especially from senior political decision makers in Lytton, to have Lytton sort of developed as an example of progressive building practice in international example that included very progressive greenhouse gas mitigation incorporated into new construction, new accessibility requirements, as well as the fire protection. Ongoing feedback with community groups in Lytton indicated that there was sort of a much more concern about fire than these other aspects, and maybe not so much of a desire from the people of Lytton to be held as that sort of international example, and more of a desire to go back to the normal lives while being protected against fire. So we had to respond to that, and I think there was decision making sort of outside of our work at ICLR, but decision making at the community level to kind of pull back on other very, very progressive practices and focus on those items that were of particular concern for the residents in Lytton. Another, actually getting on to the finance aspect, another important part about the experience in Lytton is that a significant proportion of the affected households were not insured. So there was no insurance coverage for over half of the structures that were lost. And that brings in the finance aspect. So with respect to the insured homes, we did, ICLR, as I mentioned before, is an insurance associated or affiliated organization. And we did work with our insurance partners to sort of confirm with many of the bigger insurers that we could bring in a new bylaw post-disaster, and if it were made into a regulation, if it were actually enacted, that they would reconstruct according to that bylaw, and that those additional costs of complying with that new bylaw would be covered as part of the insurance policy. So typically a contract would include coverage for new construction requirements, new building codes, et cetera. So we worked with our insurance partners to ensure that that would be the case. For the uninsured residents, there is actually, it's a much more difficult discussion because they have to finance reconstruction on their own, and the additional cost of complying with fire protection, which we estimated on average to be about $5,000 per structure, is not something that they necessarily had the appetite to cover on top of everything else. So we did have to work with other partners, nonprofit sectors, provincial players, et cetera, to work to identify sources of financing for these additional measures. And so that's an important consideration. The other part of sort of the policy discussion was the benefit cost assessment. So relying on the methods that were used for the National Wildfire Guide, a local benefit cost assessment was conducted as well as part of convincing the decision makers that it was worthwhile effort. And with respect to local and fit with the adaptation measures, I think I covered that in my comments previously, but we did have to respond to the needs, to the priorities of the community, which was focused on protection of buildings and also recovering as quickly as possible. And I would also say that there was a lot of community engagement, sort of the work of ICLR in terms of working on the ground in the community was initiated by the Recovery Committee in Lytton, which was led by a local representative and several other local representatives. And so there was quite a bit of interaction with those groups, and the process of bylaw adoption itself lent itself to significant interaction, review, engagement with the population in Lytton. As I mentioned, the bylaw has passed third reading, so it's gone through 2 readings with significant comment review from the Lytton Council, and then passed third reading, and it's now at a stage where it's being sort of reviewed at the provincial level. So there's a lot of engagement at the local level to get to the bylaw to where it is now. I'll pass it back to Marianne.
All right, that's it from us. So thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for questions. If you just want people to type them in the question and answer, and we can answer them.
Yes, exactly. Also, thank you very much, Dan and Marianne. This was, I guess, everyone can see why this project was very interesting to be showcased as an exemplary notice that we produced. And so we will now welcome a few short questions. I mean, if you guys have questions, if our viewers have questions on this initiative or on our work, I see that we already have a few questions in the chat, in the Q&A section of the Zoom. I saw someone ask if the documentation will be sent by email after the webinar. Yes, we will send the documentation and the links that we provided during this conference by email after the conference is over. If there are any other questions for Marianne or Dan, or for any members of the conference, for any of our panelists that talked earlier, they are now welcomed. If there is no question, then maybe we can move on, but I will maybe wait a few more seconds if someone is typing. If not, we will move on to the next section. So I would really like to thank Dan and Marianne again for their time and their commitment to our work. And this was a very interesting initiative, a very interesting project, and with a lot that was very in line with the 10 principles and really showcased how effective action can be taken at every stage of the project and with every stakeholders engaged. So thank you very much for that. That was, I think, a great addition to this presentation. Thank you so much. So because there is no more question, we will move on to the next part, which is the presentation of the second work that we did this year. And which is an actionable catalog of methods and tools for resilience assessment. This work comes from a new definition, or a more precise definition of risk assessment that has been developed in recent years by the IPCC. And so the concept of risk is a key aspect of how the IPCC assesses and communicates to decision makers the potential adverse impacts and potential responses to climate change. And so the use of the concept of risk has not always been fully consistent. And so they decided, the IPCC really put a lot of focus in recent years into defining precisely risk assessment and its components. So the core definition of risk is the potential for adverse consequences for human or ecological systems. And so in the context of climate change, risks can arise from potential impacts of climate change as well as human responses to climate change. So relevant adverse consequences include those on lives, but also on livelihoods, on health, and on human well-being, but also on economic and social and cultural assets and investments, on infrastructure, on services, which of course include ecosystem services, and of course the risks and impacts on ecosystems and species themselves. So in the context of climate change impacts, risks result from dynamic interactions between climate-related hazards and the exposure and vulnerability of the human affected by the climate change, the ecological hazards, or even not only humans, but also ecological systems. So hazards and exposure and vulnerability may each be subject to uncertainty in terms of magnitude, in terms of likelihood, and they may change over time and over space, over geographical spaces, due to many different factors, be it socioeconomic factors, and even sometimes human decision makings and action. So what we found is that with clearer and clearer guidelines and clearer definitions of risk assessment and of ecological risks, and also with the realization of the urgency of climate change, there has been an ever stronger push for assessing the resilience of buildings and assets and cities and territories to climate change. And so therefore to adapt to climate change, be it at the national level, but also at the international level with pushes within the EU and also at the UN level. And so the next step, obviously, was to begin evaluating the resilience of buildings and cities and assets. But the real question would be how to do that. So infrastructure resilience is usually defined as the ability to reduce the magnitude and or duration of disruptive events, and the effectiveness of resilient infrastructure depends on its ability to adapt and absorb and rapidly recover from disruptive events. So as conditions change over time, cities that are resilient can evolve in the face of disaster and stop failure from rippling through systems. They can reestablish function quickly and avoid long-term disruptions. So the first component of building a resilient city is actually evaluating the resilience, assessing the resilience level of either the asset or the community of interest. And so since resilience is a spatial representation of risks, it is only natural to use risk assessment methods that are specifically targeted at resilience. However, because resilience is a relatively new field, and because there is a wide variety of assets to monitor, a wide variety of hazards, and a wide variety of stakeholders, they don't have the same need. And so it led to the emergence of a profusion of assessment methods, and especially of approach types. And in particular, there are two different but complementary approach types, two categories of methodology that we can classify into two approach types. So the first one being climate vulnerability and risk assessment, CVRA, which actually translates the IPCC framing of risks into actionable steps and step-by-step processes actually to assess risks and vulnerabilities. So these methodologies provide guides and guidelines to accompany stakeholders who want to evaluate the risks of their sector, of their assets. And so it's a very wide-ranging approach that gives an actionable plan to improve resilience. And on the other hand, the second approach is climate resilience, is classified as climate resilience rating, which is a scale, a scoring, really a rating based on questionnaires. It provides a picture of the resilience capacity of the studied system at a given time. So it's a tool to get an understandable evaluation of the risk factor. It is particularly helpful to develop a regulatory framework. So CVRA for actors who need a recipe for change, while CRR tells you where you stand. Both approaches are essential and they are fundamentally different, but complementary. And so given all that, our adaptation group, what we decided to work on is establishing a comprehensive database, or rather, I should say, a tool, an actionable tool. So we collected methodologies and in a general sense. So the main idea, the main aim of this endeavor is to share knowledge, first of all, and to level up competency among stakeholders, know-how among stakeholders, to foster and accelerate the adaptation of our cities and infrastructures. So all of the methodologies that we collected should serve as an inspiration source and a collection of best practices for every stakeholder. So our database targets all stakeholders amongst the value chain and life cycle of buildings and construction. It encompasses a wide range of scopes of hazards, and it targets construction from the building and asset scale to even the city or maybe national scale. So the objective is to centralize knowledge and allow stakeholders to access the most suitable knowledge and most suitable tools for their own projects. So this work, the collection works is an ongoing one, and we will continue to expand our database. So what we consolidated for now has been consolidated thanks to the work of our members, but it is always meant to be an evolving and collaborative tool. So let me show you how the tool actually works, the actual database and tool that we prepared. So it is accessible through our website, still the same, globalabc-adaptation-wg.org. And you can scroll down to find our resilience assessment tool. And if you actually go into it, it will simply be an actionable list, a searchable database that includes many different criteria, filters that you can, that are very easy to understand and easy to implement, to filter all the methodologies that we have listed in the database based on many different criteria. So of course, approach type, as I just described, is listed. So we can find CRR and CVRA approaches depending on the need of the stakeholders, the actors that want to use the tool and find the methodology assessment. And then of course, we have methodologies targeted for a wide variety of hazards, droughts, floods, landslide, heavy rains, wildfire, you name it. And then, of course, every other actor's type of user is also targeted. There are categories for every one of them, from architect to homeowners to project developers to legislator. And there are also criteria to filter through based on the tool that is actually most suited to your own uses. So it can be a list of recommendations, a checklist, a web-based tool. So our tool, the one that we provide, this database, is really meant to be actionable and accessible for everyone. It is free of use and available for everyone. You can simply use the web interface to find and filter through and find the methodology that is best suited for you. Or you can, of course, download the whole database from the same website to use offline if you need. So actually what it does when you filter through our database, it will then allow you to go to a specific and detailed description of the method, the way it works, and every single criteria that might be useful in understanding and actually acting upon the tool and implementing resilience and adaptation in your own projects. It will also lead to more documentation and provide stakeholders and actors with every single information that is at your disposal. The goal, once again, is to elevate the discussion, elevate the competency and capability of every stakeholders, whatever their own knowledge and know-how is. And of course, as I just mentioned, this is a collaborative tool, and we consolidated it with our members. But of course, it is meant to be a platform. Our platform is a platform to share knowledge. So of course, we will update the database regularly. And if you know or develop your own methodologies, assessment methodologies for resilience or framework for adaptation, you can also submit it to be added to our database through the same website. We have a submission form to add more and more knowledge into this database and share, so we can all level up at the same pace. I will now go into a phase of questions about this second work tool, if you have any. I see that there is one. No, there is no question from
It's the same one as.
Oh, it's the same one, right? So if any viewers or listeners have a question about this second work, the tool that we developed, how to use it, or any other, we can listen to you and answer it right now, or else we are going to conclude this event with a call for action and also introduce the following step that you may take to act upon this conference and prepare COP27 the best. So as I see there is no question, we will move forward. And we'll explain in more details what the next steps are to promote and act upon the newfound knowledge on adaptation. So I will invite to the floor Julie Prigent, who is also a co-chair of this working group, and she's a European and international lead at the French Agency for Ecological Transition. So Julie, the floor is yours, and Julie is going to talk about adaptation and buildings and at COP27.
Hi everyone. Thank you for the floor, Victor. So as you can see on the slide, there is a very packed schedule for COP27. Those are all, and the next slide also is also a list. Those are all adaptation and buildings events at COP27. Most of them include some of our members, but the main ones that we are participating in are the one with the arrows pointed at them on the side. There are a lot of them that will be available to follow online. Some of the links are included in the PowerPoint, so feel free to follow them from home or at COP if you are there, but we are aware that not everyone can go this year either. The time that you see in this table, I really want to point that out because this is important. We do not want you to connect, 1 hour later. So those are the Egyptian time. So you might want to translate that in your local time. If we see the next slide, there are also a lot of events. I don't know if you have them there. Maybe it's not working.
Yeah, sorry.
It's fine. I have, So there are a lot of events on the 17th of November, which is the day that is underlined as the Human Settlements Day at COP. This is the Marrakesh Partnership priority for that day. So it explains why there's so many events and some of them are overlapping. So you may want to pick one or two or more, but so yes, and so some of us are also going to be there, some panelists from here at COP. So if you want to connect, do not hesitate to do so. And now I may go on to what's the working group to do next year. So COP27, obviously a big step as we will present our new works, and it's also an event that we can take stock of to see where the work at and what can be improved, connect with other people, other members, and share the good word. And then for COP28, we will prepare and then present there a new report that we will work on during 2023, which is going to be on how to assess buildings actors' contribution to climate change adaptation. So a lot of work on our next year, but we'll manage, and everyone that is interested to join, also feel free to contact us to tell us so. And then just for the last slide, I won't keep you much longer. So yes, do connect local, regional, international events, it is very important to do so, but I'm not, saying anything new there. So really just share the good word, share our results, share the contacts, share knowledge together. And yes, we hope that you enjoyed the webinar, that you learned some good examples and how to apply the 10 principles and also the guidelines for resilience. And yes, see you soon, I guess.
So thank you very much, Julie, for that, for concluding this event. I would really like to thank all of our panelists, so Judy, Salim, Sakina, Julie, and our guests, Dan and Marianne. Thank you very much for the participation. Thank you very much for the work. I would like to thank every member of the working group, of our adaptation working group, for their tremendous work this whole year. The tools we produced and the content we produced this year, again, I think is really groundbreaking and useful, actionable. So I really look forward to working with you again and to see the next adaptation event in which our members will take part in during COP27. I would like to thank every viewer. Thank you very much for coming to this event. Please continue sharing the work and leveling up, sharing knowledge, sharing know-how about adaptation. This is a project that we are all on board with, that we should all take part in. So thank you very much, and we will see you some other time. Thank you everyone. Goodbye.
Well, thank you, Victor and Sakina too.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining.